naked will be walking behind me. So
darn it. I remember you pitched the character right then and there.
But I went out on the balcony of this rental we were staying at, and I was like, it's gone. It's left me. Sometimes we're driven for the sake of drive. And I think what we really need to do, each of us in life in general, is find our why. So if you don't bring it into the universe, it will find a way to do that.
Hi, and welcome to Multiple Curiosities, my new podcast. My first guest, her name is Lindsey Leavitt, and she is a good friend. She is a writer, a former teacher, a world traveler, a master of the arts, a wrangler of teenagers, an agent of change, and a napper. She is now the author of a brand new book called Willis Wilbur Wows the World, and she's going to talk about that with us today. And hi, Lindsey, how are you?
I'm excellent.
I want you to tell us about the story of this new book and how you got the idea.
Jamie and I and her husband, Matt, so just a little bit of backstory. I've been friends with Jamie's husband, Matt, since before both of our first books debuted. So I think I met Matt at the King's English Bookshop in 2008 or 2009. Matt and I went to the National SVWI conference in LA a few times. There's always some kind of magic that has always happened there for us. So we had gone to a class by an editor. It ended up being a good class. It just wasn't what we anticipated the class to be. Now, this editor is also a writing coach and I believe a life coach. She had used some of her practices within this class, and it was a very large class. So it was kind of surprising to get into the mindset where it's like, I want you to close your eyes. I want you to picture this character, that kind of stuff. So afterwards, we were at lunch, and I believe this actually was probably my exposure to a life coach. I don't even know if I was aware of the concept of it, to be honest. I'm very aware of the concept of a therapist. So we at Ledge were talking about what is a life coach? How does one become a life coach? What are the practices? What are the different fields you can go into? It was 2017 or 2018.
I remember, so I was in the class with you and I was like, it was almost the end of the conference. And by the way, anybody who has never heard of SCBWI, it stands for
Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators.
So it was getting down to the end and I was like, I wanted when you go to these conferences, you're wanting that magic to happen. And so you're like, oh my gosh, I need this idea, or I need to meet the right person, or I need to see the right thing that's going to inspire something. We were getting down to the end and I was like, this is one of the last classes. And I'm never going to another editor's class ever again because she's not telling me anything. And she wasn't talking about story. And then I was like, a guided meditation. I was like, right. What the heck?
It's funny because looking back, it was actually a really good class. And again, it was a really large room. So I think to then bust out the meditation towards the end, it was just like, we were tired and we were done. I wish I could go back in time. I would leave myself there and I wouldn't talk to myself from the previous time, but I wish I could go and sit in the back of that class and experience it again after having written this book and after having learned everything. What's funny is we were like, why are we doing a meditative practice? And that actually is what sparked this book. So we were at lunch. We were talking about how you would use the practice of life coaching with your characters. And then we were saying well, couldn't you just make a character who's a life coach? Matt and his friend John had said, well, it'd be really funny if that character was a teenager. And I said, no, it would be funny if that character was a kid and he was a kid life coach. And then I was like, I call it, that's mine. I'm writing that.
I know. And it was like, I remember you pitched the character right then and there. It was like, you saw him in your mind.
He formed, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he would be like this and he would be like this. And I I would say of a lot of books I've written, for me, sometimes I start with the idea and sometimes I start with a character. And I don't know if I've ever had a book where the idea is the character quite like this. Once it was a 9-year-old life coach, Willis, formed for me. I sat with him. If this was 2017, then I sat with him for 2 years. If it was 2018, I sat with him for a year. So that was kind of like the genesis of the idea. I sat with that idea. I kind of noticed kids who are around that age, and I noticed traits about them that I thought, how would Willis act that way? How would Willis handle that? So he didn't end up being exactly like the kid that we started talking about at lunch. You know what? He's pretty dang close. I had a few words that were like my driving character trait words. I do remember one was gumption. That's kind of a theme throughout the book. I have many book ideas at any given time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not only is the timing of the idea its own thing, it's the timing of when is the time for me personally to write this book. You know, Big Magic has a whole chapter saying by Elizabeth Gilbert, if you don't write the book soon enough, like if you sit with that idea forever, it says that idea will leave you. The idea is like, hey, I'm here. I'm going to sit with you, but like, I want to be, and I want to be into the universe. And so if you don't bring it into the universe, it will find a way to do that. Also, there's a phenomenon that happens that's like really scary. Before your books come out, maybe you're still drafting it and you hear about a book and it sounds exactly like your book. The idea jumped. I didn't write it in time and now it's already out there. And I actually had that happen. I had a book just jump completely because I forgot about the book and I haven't. It's like on my wall right there, but I haven't worked on it. Without revealing it, it had a theme that was similar to Brigadoon. And I was pitching it kind of like as Brigadoon in Idaho, because we talked about that book, Jamie, when we were walking through pastures in the Lake District one day in England.
Yeah.
And Matt's kind of always my fantasy or sci-fi source.
I could clip that. So it says, Matt's always been my fantasy. Like,
so Matt has always been my source for many of these certain topics, such as sci-fi or fantasy.
Yeah.
So Matt was aware of this book. He sent me a link to the show on Apple TV called Schmigadoon. And that was one of those, like, I saw the link, swear words were said. I threw my phone, and I remember I was in Idaho, weird, in Bear Lake, Idaho. But I like went out on the balcony of this rental we were staying at, and I was like, it's gone. It's left me. It's on Apple TV now.
Oh.
And it kind of does take, even though I then watched it totally different than what I was writing, there's also space to have all these other books, right, that are similar, because even if it is the same idea, you could have a book about someone on the junior Olympic team for softball and someone on the junior Olympic team for basketball. It's a different book and it's a different experience and it's a different author. So it's a different person telling it. But it doesn't always feel like that. And
it does take the wind out of your sails, I think.
Yeah.
You know, because that happened to me. I was working on this one book. It was not good, but it was my first one that I actually like finished. Like I got to the finish line. And it was
your first book of fiction that you finished.
Yeah. And it was back in 2011. It was about this girl who was a violinist and she meets somebody famous on an airplane. And then they go to England together and they hang out and they fall in love or something. Erin, our mutual friend, Erin Summerall, she was like, oh my gosh, Jamie, somebody's writing like the same book. It's about a girl who's a violinist who goes on a plane and meets a famous guy and they fall in love. And I was like, great. I was like, never mind. And then I'll just let it go. And then it just sort of like deflates it. And then about 5 months ago, that movie got made into a movie, Amazon Prime. And it's like, I don't know, it's one of those sappy kind of romance.
Is it the statistical probability of love at first sight?
Uh,
by Jennifer Smith.
oh, no.
Because that's another
actually.
one. And they meet on a flight on the way to, I believe, London.
Yeah. So we were all having that same
which
idea.
Which is such a great meet cute. It's such a great like crucible because like they're stuck on that plane, they can't get off. So yeah, it's just like there's so many elements, there's so many tropes, and really it's like how that comes together is it's always unique. And even like on a show, you think like sometimes you'll watch something and it's like I've totally seen this before, but there's something special or magical, and it could be like the chemistry between the actors. It could be like the dialogue's really sharp. There's a show on HBO called Starstruck that I watched recently 2 or 3 times. And it's a girl and she's at a bar for New Year's, and it's not a children's story. It's MA. But she's at a bar and I think she runs into a guy in the bathroom, and she's kind of just like, who are you? And she also has like a New Zealand accent in London. And then it turns out that guy that she just randomly meets is famous. And so it's kind of like that, like, you know, we could think of a million stories like that, like Notting Hill or I can't think of a million. I can only think of one right now, actually.
Of course.
There you go. I gave you one. She's so delightful and so funny that it's one of those things that it's like, I will follow you anywhere. I love this. I love that trope. That's one of my favorite tropes. But this actress really shines in the role. And there's situations that are just funny and cute. And so I think sometimes we have to think of that as writers too, because again, bringing it back to Willis Wilbur, maybe there's a book with another kid life coach in it, but none of those books are Willis Wilbur. By being mindful of that and knowing like there's no new stories, there's just new ways to tell it, or there's having a character that, again, we will follow that character to the ends of the world. We don't really care what the character's doing. We just fall in love with them. There's so many different entrance points. I don't think it should be a deterrent. Yeah. And sometimes if it is a deterrent, then maybe you aren't into that story as much anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I want to go back. There's something that you said in there about how that trope of how fun, you know, meeting a famous person, and definitely one of my fantasies. And obviously it's some of these other people's fantasies who are writing these stories. And so I'm going to talk about like, what are your fantasies that drive you? And then what was your imaginative play like as a kid?
Okay, great questions. I have a younger sister. She's 8 years younger than me. And so I have an older brother and 2 younger brothers. And I was very into sports and like getting dirty. And I always like cut my hair really short. The term we would have used at the time was like tomboy. I don't think that's a term. But I mean, I learned hygiene, but like that was the extent of it, if that makes sense. And I didn't like wearing a dress. I liked like being in the dirt, and I was active. To contrast that, I would be in class and I would like look at other girls and I'd be like, their hair's curled. Like, who curled their hair? And do they curl their hair every morning and like wake up and do that every morning? And you know, my mom was present. It's not that my mom wasn't a part of it. I also had like very stick straight hair that wouldn't curl. I cut my hair a few times. She made do with the matter that she had there. And also I was very like, my brothers were all very into baseball. So I collected baseball cards because then I got to go to all these baseball card conventions with my dad. So some of it was kind of like, this is a good bonding point for us if I have these same interests. And so when I was falling asleep at night, I would create like scenarios, right? Like, and I would think if I had the scenario before I fall asleep, maybe I'll dream about the scenario. But it was like, I didn't call it anything, but it was like a pre-dream. So I would be in bed at night and I'd be like, and now we last left our our hero here. Yeah, here we are again. And what's happened today?
Yeah.
And so it was basically, my fantasy was The Bachelor before The Bachelor was out.
Oh my.
Or like the book, The Selection for YA, where they would call girls from all across the land. And the land I grew up in was Las Vegas. And it was like, he was like a 12-year-old prince. So, I mean, it was like age appropriate in my fantasy.
Of course.
Or maybe he was like Justin Bieber-esque. Actually, it might have been Joey McIntyre. Maybe it was, who's to say? So it was like, or whichever new kids on the block would have me at that point.
Right.
And they were saying,
Joey was the youngest, so
Joey was the youngest. Yeah. And
he's the only one who it wouldn't be illegal.
Right. Did you ever do this thing where you would like look at a celebrity and you were like, oh man, he's too short or he's too old, and it would like never work out?
Yeah.
It's funny because all of those celebrities, like my husband now is 10 years older than me. So all of the celebrities that it was like, it could never be, are all younger than my husband now. So it's like, you proved yourself wrong, Lindsey. Like, it could have happened. It could have. I could have held out for Joey.
It's too bad that you put the limits on yourself that you did.
Really, but not in my pre-dream, in which we would come in, and it was like they had a manager or maybe like a lady in waiting. It kind of rotated if it was like in present day or in the past in this like fantasy, and they would give us all makeovers. And I would like sometimes really think about the details of the makeover. Like, oh my gosh, I'll have like the highest bangs in all the land. And like, I'll get this cool perm, and I will wear things from the Gap. And then, you know, later that became Contempo casuals. Like, so I would exist in that. But
I love how specific this is, Lindsey.
It was. And I'm publicly stating this, and I don't think I ever have, and I don't think I've even thought of this until this moment. And it's not imaginative play, but it is imaginative. They would line him up, and then he would like come to each of us and like talk to us. When he would talk to me, it would be like, oh my gosh, you like baseball cards? I like baseball cards. And so it was like all the things that I was suddenly all the things that someone would be attracted to.
Right.
And so it would be like, he would like look at me and it'd be like, but it's your personality.
Oh yeah. It's like, it's that Taylor Swift song, you know, like,
yes,
he wears short skirts. I will wear sneakers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that is my trope. And it's funny because I think maybe my first book is called Princess for Hire. And I think it's mostly out of print now. So good luck finding it, which is probably good because I wrote it when I was like 25 and it makes me cringe. But it's that same thing of she's a girl who gets a job substituting for princesses, and she herself is a little like awkward. And so she like is thrown into these different situations, and like it's not like she has like taken an etiquette class or has this royal upbringing. And so I think it was that same kind of thing of like the fish out of water being celebrated for being a fish out of water.
He's gonna look past all those other girls,
right?
All those perfect girls, and then of course find you because you're you.
Right. While I was trying to figure out who I was, somebody knowing who I was, maybe almost for me and liking it.
Oh, and yeah, definitely.
That also comes from a place of like wanting to be liked, like my whole life, which brings me to like kind of why I became funny, because once I figured out if I was funny, that's like very likable. Like now I'm like super likable. But that was the thing that was like more universal. And if I was existing based on, you know, how high my bangs were, then even that isn't everybody's cup of tea. I would say my driving force was anxiety. And I was talking to my friend Matt Kirby, like Matt, he's not like the most pivotal person in my life, but it's funny that like these 3 stories are now all like the Matt trifecta. But Matt and I were at a conference not too long ago, And I remember we were sitting in the hotel lobby. I was talking about, oh, this is how I speak, and this is how I present myself as an author. And since I've had some trauma since I became a writer, here's how that's changed. And I said, but I didn't have anxiety before this trauma. So this is all like situational anxiety. And so Matt, who's also a child,
he's a child. Well, he's a school psychologist.
He's a school psychologist. That's right.
Like one class and certification away from being an actual child psychologist.
Right. He isn't one, but he plays one on TV or when I'm having a conversation with him, and then he does it for me.
Yeah.
So Matt was like
in your nighttime dreams.
Yeah.
Or the pre-dreams. What were you calling them?
A pre-dream.
Yeah. I like that.
So I know that would be a fun book thing. I call it for a character to do, to like every night try to have this dream happen, and then
Willis could totally do that as a practice. He could call it like
it is. I just created a whole new model actually. But anyway, Matt and I were talking, and I can't remember what the comment was I had, but he was like, "Well, that sounds like generalized anxiety and that you've had it in childhood." And I'm like, "No, I was great. What are you talking about? Like
I didn't have anxiety."
Yeah. I'm like the trauma happened. It's the trauma's fault. This isn't me. And then kind of like, as I talked to him about it, like, I remember one of the examples was, when you talk about your childhood sometime and you'll say to somebody, remember when you used to do this? Like, remember when you used to pretend a prince was going to pick you and he lined you up, but he liked you for your personality, and people look at you like, that's not a thing. That's not a universal thing.
Yeah.
I had said that before I went to bed at night, I had my ritual, and I would go through every bad possible thing that could happen in the night. And then I would, oh, your eyes are widening. How odd. Not you.
Oh, that's so sad.
I would go through and I would say I'd say a prayer, and I would, before I could even have a discourse with God, I had to get this part of the prayer in, which it's very superstitious too.
Yeah.
Where it was please listen, no one will be murdered. No one will be under my bed. No one will be this. And I had all these things. And part of it was scary stories to tell in the dark, really messed me up. But he's like, yeah, that's catastrophic thinking. That sounds like anxiety. And so once I figured that out, I figured out that I had high functioning anxiety, and that anxiety had been this driving force for me. And for, good came of it. It doesn't mean that that's a good thing, but sometimes it's hard for us to figure out where our mental illness starts and we start, because we kind of are our mental illness too, which is a really I was so resistant to that and so frustrated by that, because I don't want to have a panic attack. I don't want to have to take medication, all of these things. But once I kind of realized this is something that lives in me and I can mitigate it, I can work through it, I can talk to a life coach about it, and all these different things, it's a part of me, and that's okay. Even now, I just went to my doctor and I'm on a new anxiety medication, and I had said it's weird because I don't have that drive anymore. Do we need to switch this up? What's going to help me have that motivation? We actually did tweak my medication, but she said, you don't want it to be that you are constantly in this white knuckled chaos that's if I don't pass this test, or if I don't turn in this book. And that's what drove me, and I my whole life I've had nightmares that I forget to take a test 20 years ago. I was an A+ student, A++ always. And and it's not like I even had if this doesn't happen, it'll be this. I didn't even know what this was. I was just, I have to get it done. I have to get it done first. I have to get it done fast. And to bring it back to Willis, I really tried to channel some of that into his character. Sometimes we're driven for the sake of drive. And I think what we really need to do, each of us in life in general, is find our why and find what do I want from this, and what is my motivation? Because we actually all have a motive, why do I want to write this book? And sometimes the answer is I really like this character and I want to spend time with them.
Yeah.
And trying to set whys that we ourselves can accomplish. Like that I have not necessarily control, because I've kind of relinquished all control, but that I have some say in. And so if I say what drives me, I love those moments when I'm working on a story and something clicks and it's like, it feels like that almost already was, like it already existed and I just unlocked it. Or like I've heard people use like the metaphor like a sculpture, like it's all in that block of marble. I just figured out how to chisel it out.
And just, to reveal it.
Yeah. And to get to that where then, because you're spending so much time with it, there's scenes in Willis Wilbur that I will reread now. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so happy I unlocked that. It is so funny and so sweet. And I love that. And then there's other parts that I'm like, where did that come from? I don't know. Like it was due the next day. So I wrote something. But I think figuring out more what our why is instead of what the drive is.
I will say this, that towards the end of the book, I was like, Willis just helped me with the problem I was just having with Matt.
Which is like, impossible. Willis, the famous Matt Kirby?
And it wasn't Matt, it was me. It was like one of those things where we all get to choose our own emotions, right? And I was frustrated because Matt wasn't apologizing.
Yeah.
And it was like, I don't want, his kind of thing was like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. And I'm like, but that it doesn't, well, then nobody would ever apologize.
Right.
Never thought they were doing anything wrong. And anyway, so I was like all frustrated. And I didn't even know why, but it was definitely, I was just frustrated at myself. And it really had nothing to do with Matt. Mm-hmm. And I think it was when Willis comes to terms with
spoiler.
Oh yeah, spoiler. Sorry. Yeah. Well, I mean, I won't say how he comes to terms, but when he resolves the incident, I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe.
I mean, it's so interesting because, people always discredit children's books, right? And it's like, you have to have a mastery of so many things to be able to turn around and explain that to an 8-year-old kid in a way that they can move forward and again, not teach to them or anything like that, but that they can find some connection in that story. And then you have to do the same thing with the teachers and the librarians and the parents, because those are the gatekeepers who are going to give that book to the kids. It's so layered. I had to have like this, again, in that class we went on, I'm like, why are we closing our eyes and going down an elevator to go meet our character and like whatever it was. But now it's like, oh, this is why. And this is how that hits Jamie is going to be different than how that hits me. And like you in this scene with the incident, like maybe that was a throwaway scene when I was writing it, but it's having like kind of a basic understanding of your subject matter so that you can have those real world applications, which is like so cool. Like that's so cool that you just told me that story. I love that.
Yeah. Well, and I also, I was going to touch upon the thing with the why versus the motivation, which I love. So I want to go back to that because I hate it when somebody teases something that they're going to talk more about and then they never get back to it. So the why versus the motivation. And I think it's kind of huge, isn't it? Like it's definitely something I've been dealing with in my own life. And I think Willis kind of touches upon it too, but also just, it's sort of embedded in the whole thing. And it's interesting because, well, I'm always trying to figure out my why and my, like why I'm doing things, why I haven't gotten my shiz together, like why I'm not doing more of what I want to be doing like now. And,
but also what does that even mean?
Yeah, exactly. And it's
like so much of it is about the discovery and like just because you tried something and it didn't have a thing that you're putting on the shelf or like saying like I did this thing, it doesn't mean that you don't have all the value of doing the thing. You're still doing.
Exactly. And the thing is if you were to have said that to me 5 months ago or 5
Right.
years ago, I would have been like, of course it's about the thing. Of
Yeah.
course I want the thing. But it's like, once you start to get to a place, and this place that you get to, you can keep getting to it over and over and over again in your life. It's not like you get a master's degree in figuring out life and then you have it figured out. Like you have to keep relearning, call it alignment or whatever. So I follow a lot of
like life coaches.
Yeah. And like, I like to listen to the Abraham Hicks people and like, so it's a little bit woo woo, right? But it's like, basically you have to keep figuring it out. It's not like you just have it figured out. The momentum builds and then you get more.
We're always becoming. We never become. And we all think that there's like this arrival place that we get to.
Yeah.
I had like when I turned 40 in a couple years, because it hasn't happened, but it totally happened. And I had like this whole, like, I think we sometimes have these milestones in our future. I'll have this kind of a family or this kind of a job or whatever. And then we get to that and it's like, oh, I'm thinking of that kid with all her pre-dreams, and none of those pre-dreams came true. But it's there's not this arrival point. If there was, gross. Like imagine arriving and being like, and here I am. And I mean, I see that a lot in publishing, in the sense, and like maybe in not necessarily a healthy way, but like when you want to get published, you think, oh, if I could just walk into a bookstore and see my book on a shelf, that's it. Then I've arrived. That's like all I've ever wanted. And then you do, and then you see all these other books on the bookshelf and you're like, well, I want more books on this shelf, or I want this book to be a Newbery winner or New York Times bestseller or whatever. And sometimes if it becomes so much about what we want to be or what that end game is, I think Amy Poehler talks about it in Yes, Please. She's going like this in the cover. But Amy Poehler says, like, we all have the pie, and that's like the thing that we're going for. And sometimes you get the pie and you're like, oh my gosh, I got the pie. That's so great. But sometimes it's just the pursuit of the pie that's important and is enough. And sometimes we get it and it's like, okay, wait a second. I thought I would be totally happy or totally self-actualized or whatever that lack is within us. And we get it. And then it's like, nothing's changed. You know, like I still have to go do the laundry now or whatever that is. And so some people, I do find a lot of published authors, it's like the post debut blues or like the second book drop, because we have put so much on this moment and there's a really cool thing. But if I set everything of myself on that thing, then when I get a bad Kirkus review or whatever else, then like I've also set myself for those things too.
Right.
So I think it's really learning to focus on, and I hate to say like the journey versus the destination.
I know, but it's,
but that's what I mean when I say the becoming. Oh, and this is one of my very, very favorite quotes. It's a quote by Kurt Vonnegut, and it talks about that becoming. And I seriously say this quote probably in every podcast I've ever been in, but it was so transformative for me.
I think that there's certain cliches that once you finally sort of integrate it, I think that's a term that therapists use. Like, when you have your epiphany or your aha moment or whatever, it's usually you'll get this, something will integrate, something will all click together in your mind. And then you try to put it into words and then it's a cliche, like enjoy the journey. It's like, well, everybody says that. I think it's okay to want the thing, get there, and then
want other things.
It's supposed to make you happy forever, because then you would never do anything more. Like you never do anything else in your life. Of course, you're supposed to get there and then want more stuff and then want the next thing. But I think it's the process of also not beating ourselves up, because like sometimes I'll think, well, I want this thing and I know this is going to be so cool. But then I think, oh, yeah, but once I get there, it's not going to make me happy. Well, of course it's not going to like make me happy. It's like you sort of like the life coaching idea. You have to be happy in order to get the thing you think is going to make you happy. And then once you get that, be okay knowing that, it's not going to make me happy forever. It might make me really pleased for this afternoon or for a week.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's
you get the
okay
dopamine
to
hit.
go for the next thing.
Yeah. And I think with life coaches too, I like that like everything I'm saying is really focused on that. It's about happiness is like, even how we define happiness is different for everybody, but like it's really wrong a lot of the times. And we put our hearts on these external things that we think will bring us happiness, where happiness can happen in all different sorts of situations.
Right.
And that's like reaching that point of self-actualization. And we don't necessarily sit with it. I might be doing super well and I might be like, wow, I'm like really comfortable with myself. But then there's wrenches that are thrown into our life over and over again. And we have to keep saying, like, how do I keep this machine rolling? I have to keep working on it and having grace in that. We have to give ourselves permission. And I know a lot of women specifically that I've talked to who they don't even think they're worthy of trying, and or they don't even think that they have the value or the time or whatever. And so I'll have women say to me, and sometimes it can be like kind of like toxic or harmful. So I was talking to a woman one time and she said, "Oh, you're a writer." And I said, "Yeah, I really love it. It's a great job." And I usually don't even tell people I'm a writer anymore because they're like my waxer or something. Like, it's always at a time where I'm like, I don't really want you to know this piece of me. Like, you're seeing enough of me right now. But she said to me, "Oh, I wish I could do a creative job like that, like work, but I just am really obsessed with my kids." And I mean, it was so loaded and so interesting. I think I made a joke that I was like, "Oh, good, I don't really like my kids that much, so I can do it." Like, I mean, like, I'm so obsessed with my kid, and I'm like, sorry, I'm like leaning into codependency over here, so I can't do that. And I think it's just important for, and this often happens in the arts and finding some creative endeavor, that it's like, when you're just sitting there, like, what do you want to be thinking about? Like, what do you want to be focusing on and growing in? You know, if we have a 9-to-5 job that's maybe not that fulfilling, or if we are a parent or like these different roles, those are all great and essential. And but to also find a thing that is deeper within us. And that's what goes to this Kurt Vonnegut quote. Kurt Vonnegut was writing a high school class had written a letter, and this was like, I think like early 2000s, maybe mid 2000s. So it was like not long before he passed away. And he actually wrote them back. He wrote this amazing letter, and Ian McKellen, is that how you say his name? Like wizard, and a bunch of other roles did a reading of this that you can find online. And one of those quotes is, "Practice any art, music, singing, dancing, acting, drawing, painting, sculpting, poetry, fiction, essays, reportage." I never know how to say that word. Reportage. Right over. "No matter how well or badly, not to get money and fame, but to experience becoming, to find out what's inside you, to make your soul grow." And that is like the line every time when I think of my why. Like, what is this? Is this making my soul grow? And sometimes no, like sometimes I have to go write a bunch of emails or do like social media, or like the things that I'm like, my soul is not growing. I'm pretty sure it's shrinking right now. But it's the practice of it. It's the finding of the thing and saying, this is a thing I love, and I love learning from it, and I want to keep pursuing it. And sometimes you do, and you get to a point where it's like, yeah, like that was really cool. I really like learning how to tap dance. Now I want to go do this. And I think the other thing is we think that that's flaky if we shift our creative pursuits. But I don't think it is, because like he says, practice any art. Like, find the thing that is what you want. And the person that I was at 20 and the things that I pursued at 20 are different than the things that I'm pursuing at 40. The thing about writing is, because it's so dang hard, and I'm never going to master it. I will never be in writing. I can only work on becoming, and that's why I'm still doing it. And that's why it's like such a wonderful lifelong pursuit, because if you catch that bug and you really like the bug, then you can keep going. Now, some writers I know were doing it because they were very, I don't know, marketing minded, or they really wanted the money and the fame, which are not bad motivators. I will say, like, that if that's your why, that's okay.
Yeah.
But
especially if it's like your why at the beginning.
Right. But sometimes you have burnout because of that. Because if it's like, well, and we talked about money, like sometimes it's like, this is all great, but I've got many mouths to feed. So I can only practice this much because I'm only getting like $1,000 advance and I spent 10 years on this book. Sometimes you're trying to kind of quantify, like we still attach monetary amounts to our time. If you can say that this period of time that I'm doing is not about the monetary pursuit, then I think it's easier to have that permission and that grace to do it. Sometimes I'm like, it's a hobby and I get paid money for it. And the reason I have to do that is because if it's a job, then I start breaking down my hourly. It's like, man, I should go back into teaching, or I should be a life coach, which I have also looked into.
I really liked how you were talking about how it feels sometimes like you're being a flake if you switch from one thing to another. That's actually why I created this podcast, because it's called Multiple Curiosities. I thought I was like struggling with that because I was like, what's wrong with me? I'm always changing my mind about what I want to do and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, it's like I have multiple curiosity disorder or something. And it's like, I can never settle down or whatever. I like what you say, that it's like, you know, you're always changing and it's always, the process is always going forward and you're becoming all the time and you're allowed to keep becoming. And I think that the great thing about writing is there was a time where, you know, I had this dream. I think I still have this dream, but for a long time, it was a dream that I knew I really couldn't do much about. And it was, I wanted to have a pumpkin patch in New England, a big one that would also have an orchard and maple syrup orchard and apple orchard and have pies.
So you just wanted to like live in a Hallmark movie.
Sleigh rides. Yeah.
Because you're like doing every season too. You're like, that's like a whole book series.
Yeah, there'd be like weddings,
the fall book,
and then I'd bake pies, and then I'd have like a knitting circle. We'd also have,
and you would also have murders happen, and it would be like the Pumpkin Patch Murder series. And
I could have like writers. We could have like retreats up there, and writers could come. Yeah, see, it's still like
I call it. I still call it.
Probably around 2007, 2008. I was like, well, that dream's. I felt like it was never going to happen. And then I was like, but I could write a story about that. And then it was suddenly like, oh my gosh, as a writer, I get to do all those things that I want to do, you know? And I think that's why a lot of people enjoy acting, because they get to you know, try out different things.
Well, you're pre-dreaming that dream, I guess. Like, I like how I'm coining this phrase, that
pre-dreaming. It's like the intention. You lay down your intentions the night before.
There's still the logistics of life, you know, like I love talking about creativity, and I'm on the personality profile. I was like the campaigner. I can't remember what my like ENF whatever thing is, but I remember it was, you love ideas and you love like being like, oh, this would be so great. And I love attaching an idea to a person and saying this, oh my, this would be so good for you.
You're so good at that.
But then it's like, oh no, I'm just running the campaign. I'm not running for office. Like, you go and do it after.
Yeah, I'm
not. I love doing that, but there's no physical possible way that I could do all of it. And I sure have tried, and I've sure burned out many a time with a book. It's that same thing. Like, I should become a life coach. I'll write about a life coach. And I still get to live in that world and find and meet people within that world and like explore it. And it's so fun. But I also don't want to stick with any world forever.
Yes. You and I actually had, like, after I finished writing my book and I was sending it out to agents, it never got picked up. You were like, okay, so what are you going to do next? And we had a lunch and you were like giving me all these ideas for a business. And I like was running with it, but I was kind of always like, well, what is this? And I was always trying to figure out what it was or how it could make money.
Mhm.
And then it kept like, it was like this swaying ship or something and it kept like maybe becoming like a life coaching thing. And I was like,
Mhm.
I can't life coach anyone. I haven't even figured out my own life and stuff like that. And then it sort of morphed into something. And then it was like tea. And then it was all these things. And then part of me was like, I cannot let this go because I can't let anyone see me not finish this. I can't
Mhm.
let anyone see me fail
Mhm.
or flake out or, I had all these stories in my head of what people would say or think. Finally, I just sort of got to this point where I was like, no, it's okay. Cause I might go back to it later. I enjoyed the process.
Right.
I could feel like this emotional pushback of me not
Mhm.
wanting to do it. And then kind of trying to, and I felt like I was always trying to get people, like I was always like the campaigner, like I was always trying to get people to come to my party. And I was like, what if nobody comes to my party once I say I'm charging to
Mhm.
come to my party? And then once I like gave myself permission to let it go and be like, no,
Mhm.
it's okay. If I don't do that, I'm okay with that because this other
Right.
thing that I want to do is probably more of the true thing.
I was such an accomplishmentaholic when I was younger, and I still kind of am. And it was like, well, what if I take this class and then I need to take another class because this filled the same general, and then I've just wasted a class. And it's like,
Ooh,
because
yeah.
you learned something in that class. Like
Yeah.
what's a waste? Like I'll
Yeah.
start a book and I'll get halfway through a book and it's like, yeah, this book's going to be nothing. And then 4 books later, I'm like, remember that character in that book? Oh, like
Yeah.
nothing is for naught. You just don't know in what way you're going to use it. And in some way it's not
Yeah.
the external thing that you're using. In some way it's like I've learned lessons through this that help me in that whatever that next endeavor is. And also like what's failure? I mean, in creative pursuits too, there's a lot of shame. Like my first book came out, it was a lead title. It sold at auction. I got a good advance. I've sold the movie rights multiple times. It's out of print. That was like, oh, I failed. And I didn't earn out the advance. I mean, I spent that sweet Disney money, but I didn't earn out. I think sometimes we have these things where it's like, this is failure and this is success. Just
Yeah.
last weekend, I was hanging out with some friends. We've been friends, some of us like 18 years, and we had kids together, and we were like starting off in our life, in our adult life together. Someone asked about an author, and I'm like, well, yeah, they're like, wait, they're super successful. And they're like, oh, do you know them and whatever. And I'm like, oh, we're not in the same circles. Like, I'm like,
Right.
they're very successful. My friend had said like, well, you're the most successful person I know. And I'm like, no, I'm not. And also I'm like, you guys are all married to doctors. Like, you're doing fine. And it kind of led to this thing of like, well, what's success? And even later she said, well,
Yeah.
if you can't say that you're successful if you've published a book, like I can't imagine publishing a book, then
And I must not be successful.
well, yeah, and
Right.
she thought there was kind of like a terminal velocity of success where it's like, well, if you reach this point, it's great to be on that, like whatever. And I'm like, well, publishers don't think that. Publishers are going to look at my previous sales. From a business standpoint, there is a quantifier, which is unfortunate. And it's very hard to separate that business quantifier from our creative
Yeah.
pursuits. And so it's like you said, like, well, I tried this and I didn't make money. And I tried this and I didn't make money. And it is a reality too. Like, I can't be so, the universe will manifest what we want it to manifest. There are like these cool, I never say this word right, kismet moments
Yeah.
that sometimes we actually make a lot of money on a thing that we really like to do. That's really
Right.
cool when that like lines
Yeah.
up. Sometimes we get an opportunity and it's like, there's nothing else I would rather put out into the world than this. And that's really cool too. Oh, hold on. Now I forgot my point. You're going to have to edit this. It was a good point.
I don't know. This is pretty funny. Lindsey being real.
Hold on. Rewind, Jamie. What were we saying?
I did this one time, by the way, on a live radio show. And I could not.
Oh, I've been doing it a lot. I don't know if I'm saying it's COVID brain fog still.
Oh, it's so my life.
So before I wrote Willis Wilbur, I was working on a sci-fi book, like a middle grade sci-fi. And I won't even say what it's about because I still love this idea. But I spent maybe yikes, like maybe 2 years on it.
Yeah. I remember you
And
talking about it.
it was beyond the scope of my imagination in a lot of ways. I was really frustrated, and my agent at the time was kind of like, maybe this isn't the book you should be writing. Like, maybe you should try something else. And I'm like, no, I'm so far in it. I need to finish it. It's like gambling.
Like a sunk cost.
Yeah. And I could also look at like, do you know how much childcare I've used on this book, or how much like other opportunities I've missed because I wasn't doing this book? I was talking to a friend, Lisa Schroeder, who also has gone to many of these conferences with us. And Lisa's book, I think it's A Night to Die For. We were talking about, Lisa has published, she's probably at almost 30 books now, and she's written in multiple genres. And so I had said, like, I just need to finish this book. And also I think sometimes like when we spend a lot of time on a project, we justify its greatness. So in my head, I'm like, well, this is my breakout novel. This is like the real deal. This is a big thing. I can't just walk away from it. Lisa had said, like, sometimes you got to know. And she's actually, I have many books that I've written because Lisa's reiterated that, like, sometimes you just got to do the thing that you do well. It's good to do things that stretch you, but if you're really stuck, then go to the other thing. You can come back to that. And so I had this Willis Wilbur idea from our discussion. And I think I'd written like maybe a 1-page character analysis. Like, I hadn't really done any work. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to do 1 month of this book. Like, what's a month of taking a break? I wrote it in like a month, like the first draft. It was like, oh, that's right. This is when I have a voice that I really like and a character that I really like. It kind of like rolled out of me. I initially wrote it as a chapter book. So I think I was writing it like a Clementine, which is kind of a cuspy chapter book, in that I think it's maybe 14,000 words. A lot of chapter books, and I've taught classes on writing chapter books. So a lot of chapter books, if they're an early chapter book, which would be like Shannon Hale's Princess in Black, I think those are like 1,500 to 2,000. Yeah. Then you've got like the Magic Treehouse kind of books, and those are often like maybe 7,000. And that's where my Commander in Chief's books fit. Those were between 7,000 and 10,000. Past that mark, and then it's where sometimes they're categorized as middle grade, sometimes they're categorized as chapter books. So I wrote this book, I want to say it was between 12 to 14,000 words as this chapter book series. It didn't really fly as a chapter book series. I went back, I did some revisions. At this point, I had entered Vermont College of Fine Arts, their writing for children and young adults program, because again, I had been so stuck with that middle grade sci-fi that I also thought like, oh, I'll go to school and someone else will help me write this book. And that's the whole reason I'm going to go to school. So I entered the program. That book. I thought I was going to finish. So
you book. Like threw more money at that book. That's totally the sunk cost fallacy.
Yes, which I still haven't gotten to. My first semester advisor was David Gill. I sat down with him and I'm like, this is what we're doing. This is what I'm going to finish. Get ready. I'm throwing a bunch of words at you. I couldn't work on this sci-fi book for one of my packets. You turn in like a packet each month. That's how the program runs. I threw Willis Wilbur at him and he was like, what are you doing? This is great.
Yeah.
Like,
I know, like, it's so cute.
Some tweaking, and don't even worry about the vocabulary. Like, just put all the fun in it and do that. Yeah. Kind of like got me out of my head. And I kind of was like, yeah, sure. But like, what about this book? I worked on with him and he was encouraging for it. But then I didn't even pick it up after that. Because then it's like, once my creative juices started flowing again, I was like, I see you. I like you. Again, maybe that book comes out in a couple of years. We'll see. But the fun was kind of gone just because of the time and effort and being so in my head about it. I sent those revisions to my agent and she's like, you're golden. And I had multiple publishers interested. So it's like, I just went from this one experience to another. Yeah. And I ended up signing with Penguin Workshop, who's been like a super fun publisher. They do really just fun, colorful, amazing books.
A lot of times we think that because something's easy for us, it's not worth focusing on, because we're like, anybody could write this story about this little life coach. No, they can't, but it came to you. And so I think a lot of times we get inspiration or we feel something's easy and therefore we think it's not worthy. And so we want to go focus on, we think is not quite there.
she said it a better way than this, but she said, sometimes you get in your head and you play against your strengths instead of like embracing what they are. And she's like, you write funny. I wrote my critical thesis on humor. I believe in humor, but sometimes we believe it doesn't have as much value as the next great American novel.
I think it's so important and it's so hard. And if you can do it, then do it, because nobody else can.
Yeah. Even when I'm writing like a very serious subject matter, I still have those scenes where it's sweet or funny. That's so important.
Totally.
We want that so much in life. I sold the book. Pretty much the note that I had was, let's make this longer. So I added about 10,000 words. I added a B story. Chapter books often don't have a B story because there's not room for it. It's like, I want this thing. I try, I fail, I try, I fail, I try to succeed. It's kind of like the format for a lot of chapter book. Willis has a friend in this draft. And in the first chapter, which is available online, I find Really Tellers near you. They posted an excerpt of the book. You find out that his friend, they were supposed to spend the summer together, and so much of who he is or how he views himself is this friendship is going away for the summer. So now he has the summer ahead of him of like, well, what am I going to do with my life? Which maybe I kind of have experienced that many times in my life too, not necessarily with the friendship, but just like, oh, I thought it was going to be this, and now I got to fill it in with something else. That kind of opened up everything, learning about life coaching. I really tried to be mindful of how a kid would view the language, the vocabulary of learning to become a life coach. So one of the jokes is, and he just like looks up articles, like the 5 ways, like 5 tips for being a life coach or whatever. I mean, there's not like a full certification course going on here. I think he basically prints off a course. Like it might even be in crayon. Like
I was laughing because the algorithms out there believe that I want to become a life coach, which I don't, but like you read it enough times and you go, oh, maybe the universe is trying to tell me something.
Right. And
no, it's Instagram and Facebook. Yeah. That's how it works. They always have the free course and then you take it and then they try to get you to buy the rest of the course, which and
then forevermore, every ad you get will be to take another. One of his was, find a guinea pig, like find somebody to break in with, find somebody to like try this out with. And so his first client is a guinea pig. This is the thing I always try to do with humor. And I do this in my chapter books and whatever else. So we all have different humor styles. I've read studies even too that say like, in kindergarten, here's how a kindergartner understands humor versus a second grader versus what if I'm writing a picture book, I try to hit the different humor styles. So like irony is something that develops. Slapstick is usually younger. But like recall or callback humor is kind of always a universal one. Like there's some humor that like most people appreciate. Sarcasm, some people don't get. So I try to hit different kinds of humor in each chapter. I also try to think this joke is for an adult reader. And it's okay if a kid doesn't get it. In my Commander in Cheese series in the second book, they're worried that this cat that lives in the Oval Office is going to eat them. And spoiler alert, this is towards the end, the cat says, I would never eat you. That's disgusting. I'm a pescatarian. And the mouse says, like, is that a disease? A kid's not necessarily going to know what a pescatarian is. Those are the kind of things where I layer it in for each one. So I'm hoping that a parent is reading this book with their kid and that the parent is snorting at some different things than the kid, but maybe some of the things they're the same. And this is very much character humor too, because I feel like he is an Amelia Bedelia-esque character. I know Amelia Bedelia is a classic. I do have some problems with this series because there are some really strong class problems and even some racism in the series, but the puns of it, Amelia Bedelia not being in on the joke and not knowing that we're laughing at her because she's misunderstanding these puns. I wanted it to be the same kind of humor in the sense that Willis is so himself that sometimes we're laughing at him being himself, but we're actually laughing with him and not at him. I didn't want him to be the butt of the joke of his own story. So Willis does a thing where he will get, I guess it's his pre-dreams, right? Like he'll get an idea and he takes that idea and explodes it to like this ridiculous amount. So
right.
if I were to say like, oh, Jamie asked me onto her podcast, and NBC is going to be watching this podcast. Now they're going to ask me to be on my own show. And then I'm going to make so much money from that show that I'm going to buy a private island, and then I'm going to have a party on the private island. Like, he takes it every time to a hyperbolic extreme. We're laughing at that. Even if he really believes that, even if he's like, I've got what it takes to make this happen. It's not something where he's the butt.
Yeah. And I'm laughing at that on another level, because I'm like, oh, he's totally like me. Like that's like, I think that way. Like, I'm always like, oh yeah, well, cause I'll take a fantasy way out into the fame fantasy. So are you any of that too? Like, was any of Willis's kind of little quirks like that, where you're sort of laughing at him? Is any of your DNA?
I would say that my thing is like his gumption, where again, a lot of mine, I mean, I am like a very driven person, and it isn't all my anxiety. Like, part of that's my personality. Like, sometimes I can't sit out what is what, but
well, some people with anxiety would just sit there and do nothing. So
yes, I mean, that's how, like, mine's high functioning, that's how it manifests. But also, I'm very driven. So, and I'm very ambitious, and sometimes I'm ambitious for the sake of ambition. I have to do this thing, and I want this thing, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to get this thing. This happens in the second book, Willis Wilbur Meets His Match, out September 27th. Willis does the same thing, where it's like, sometimes he's almost blinded by his gumption or his pursuit or his ambition, that he loses sight of what he's really doing and why. He loses sight of his why. My mom had read the book, and she had said something like, he's pretty like mature for a 9-year-old. It is somewhat a fantasy in that sense.
Like, well, it's kind of like the Peanuts, definitely like the Lucy Van Pelt, where she puts up her shingle, the 5 cents for talking to her, like where she's a therapist, but also they all talk like adults. And so when I was reading it, I was like, this is very Peanuts-y.
They're precocious. So I said, Ted Lasso was a show that I had already written the first one when that show came out, but I was writing the second. And I thought about that. He's like going to keep trying. And well, it's belief, like he hangs it up and it's like, oh, I don't know anything about soccer. I'll learn soccer and I'll be a coach for soccer. And he just has this like faith and this determination, but he does it with kindness. And so sometimes I'll say like, wow, this reminds me of Willis. I can't like pitch Ted Lasso like on the cover, like the next Ted Lasso, because that's an adult show. I also saw a lot of Leslie Knope from Parks and Rec. When I originally pitched the book, I said he kind of reminds me of a Leslie Knope meets a Tim Gunn, where he's driven and sometimes his drive is wild. Like in Leslie Knope, like I could see him becoming Tim Gunn when he grows up, who's also like incredibly kind.
But I love that you brought it around to Ted Lasso, because that's like my favorite show.
It's just my pitch, because that's what I say, like, oh, have you seen Ted Lasso? And like, I mean, 90% of people I've talked to, 95 love the show. And so I'll say, okay, this is like a kid Ted Lasso. And that sells it for me. I feel like when I say, oh, it's like this funny book about a 9-year-old life coach, their eyes kind of go like, okay, I don't need to read a self-help book. So I probably should work on the pitch in that sense, because it's really not about that. It's about a kid who sets his mind to something and against all odds works on it. And even those odds sometimes are funny, because he just has this audacity about him that he believes that these things are going to happen, and he'll just keep doing it, because why not him? And I wish I was more like that sometimes.
I love how he's not self-aware until he is, and then he keeps having these sort of moments of self-discovery. And I love how, because he's a life coach, he's able to have these revelations for himself and be more on the nose about them. Any other kid's book couldn't really necessarily address these themes quite so literally, and yet this can, and it's delightful and funny and adorable. And I want to be Willis's next client. He's just so cool.
It's been a while since I've written a book where it's kids that age So it kind of has a little nostalgia, like the Penderwicks or Boxcar Children or something like that, where I really hope that there's like it gives it some longevity.
So Lindsey, thank you so much for being my guinea pig.
Yes.
You're one of my favorite people. You're one of my favorite authors. I love hanging out with you. And I think that
I love hanging out with you, Jamie. It is so fun because I mean, this is like us talking.
I know.
Anytime. So
it's so great.
Where we can't get off the phone and we can't get off the recording now, but
I'm definitely working on my ending. I got to stick the landing, but I'm not there yet. So
you'll find it. It was an absolute delight. Maybe now you'll have like banjo music play that like brings us out or something. I hope that's what you do.
I hope so too.
And I know Jamie will include links to everything.
Yeah.
And
the links will all be down in the description below.
My next series or whatever will come out again.
Yeah.
We'll have multiple discussions about multiple curiosities.
Excellent.
With joy.
Well, thanks so much, Lindsey, and I'll talk to you later.